This
meeting is being recorded.
I mean, we can talk about the whole chapter. You know, we can.
Sure.
The reason I had to break it somewhere, and it was either if I broke it, unless I broke it in the middle of a section, either it had to be short at the beginning or short at the end. So, but his point seemed to me to be they had to do this. That seemed to be the conclusion. So.
Yeah, but I thought the way he did it was, I don't know how to phrase it, but it was like he was unhappy, even though he knew what he was doing, because even though he did say it was a necessity, because remember, he doesn't create, but identifies a comparative potential policies, right? You know, late imperial Russian, you know, what about a softer Stalinism? What about a Menshevik? You know, more, you know, bourgeois representative government with a stronger middle class, and then almost like a thought experiment plays it out into the future. And what I found odd though is, why was it necessary? Does he ever say Nazi Germany in that section? Because that was everything. If the Soviet Union had it industrialized in the late 20s, early 30s, and then the mid 30s, to regain what it had lost during the Civil War, the Revolution, the Civil War, I don't see how Germany could have been stopped in the suburbs of Moscow. I think that.
Are you referring to Leningrad? Is that what you're referring to?
Well, the whole German invasion without a declaration of war. Yeah, that the Russian front, the Soviet front, the Eastern Front, that stretched from Gulf of Finland to Stalingrad.
I'm sorry, Stalingrad at the time. It was Stalingrad. You're right.
Yeah.
I don't really know too much about the Eastern Front of World War II, but like, what did they do at Stalingrad and the Battle of Kursk that really turned the war?
You have to remember that the Soviet army fought 80% of the German army.
Mm-hmm.
That's how much it fought. Leningrad was laid under siege for over a year. People were eating cardboard, leather, rats, glue. The Germans reached the suburbs of Moscow so they could hear the church bells in the capital city. And then they, in the southeast on the Volga River, I believe, took something like 9/10 of the city of Stalingrad. That used to be called Volgograd. And somehow the Soviets hung on by their fingernails and pushed the Germans out of Stalingrad. And that's the beginning. Oh God, Stalingrad, I think, started in autumn of 42, but by pushing them out of Stalingrad, that's the beginning of the Soviet counteroffensive that ends with the Soviet troops in Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Kursk was after the Germans had been pushed back a sizable distance, miles. I think it was in 1943. And what's extraordinarily interesting about that was really the last great tank battle, because the Germans lost so many tanks. The Germans went on the offensive. What the Soviet army did, it's remarkable, extraordinarily remarkable. They created barriers at the anticipated, because of the topography, they kind of figured out where, if the Germans were going to counterattack, where would they do that? And there were three potential ways to attack this metal concentration. So the Soviets created these defensive barriers that were embedded in the earth that made it extraordinarily difficult for a tank to go through it or around it. And the Germans got through the first one, but then got caught up in the second one. And then it was just the tenaciousness of the German people that caused the war to go on until May of 1945.
If there's anybody that likes board games, the Axis and Allies board game is an exceptionally good board game for learning the economic resources of each one. I actually had my sons play it when they were learning World War II history, and they got a really good idea of pretty much everything that was going on at the time. And I'm a nerd, so I love this game. And we actually have in the community a Stalingrad map, if anybody ever wants to play it. So it's there too. I can email it to the list.
Joseph, have you ever played Diplomacy?
I have it on my shelf. I love it. It's wonderful.
The board is a map of Europe in 1914. And the only larger independent country that's not drawn on it is Montenegro. And you can have up to 7 players for the 7 great powers at World War I. And there's no dice. I love it because there's no dice. You just write orders to your fleet or army, and only 1 unit can be on any geographically marked territory. You really can see if someone is following any kind of code other than I want to win.
Yes, diplomacy can be a lot of fun in a group, but also create a lot of tension. So
I used it in one of my classes, and there were 4 teams. One person on one team said, let me talk to my friend. He's on the other team. If they're going to stab us in the back, I know we're friends. I know he'll tell me. Well, that other team stabbed him in the back. His friend never told him it was coming. And that really damaged their friendship. And I thought, oh shit, I'm just trying to do a non-computer simulation, and I'm damaging people's lives. I felt like shit.
well, it does introduce the human component, which I do think relates to what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Well, I want to read just a couple of things that seems to me to sum up Bataille's. Problem is, I'm not, Ed and maybe some of you guys are better qualified to, whether there were any other options or whether his analysis of the history is correct or not, because I really just don't know. But at the bottom of page 163, he says, so the painful solution of the problem, apparently the Soviet Union, and even speaking more generally, Russia, owing to the Tsarist legacy, would not have been able to survive without a massive allocation of its resources to industrial equipment. And then on bottom of 164, the Russian world had to make up for the backwardness of Tsarist society, and this was necessarily so painful, it demanded an effort so great that the hard way, in every sense, the most costly way, became its only solution. So that seems to be his conclusion. And again, I'm not in a position to evaluate his historical analysis because I just don't know the history, and I don't understand economics well enough and all that. But that his thesis seems to be that this was literally the only way that they could survive. I mean, literally what he says is survive. Like this was the only way the nation would survive. I don't know what that would have meant if they hadn't have done that. Would it have meant millions dying, or would it have meant that they would have been taken over by Germany, or what? I don't know what it meant, but that's, as far as he was concerned, that it was just a matter of sheer survival of the nation as a nation, I guess.
The implication of his analysis of it is that without the 2 5-year plans, primitive socialist accumulation, the Soviet Union would not have been able to industrialize sufficiently enough to provide armaments to its army to stop the German army from pushing all the way to the Urals, basically conquer European Russia. And then if you can imagine the Germans reaching the Caucasus oil fields, which would then, it's a plus and a minus right now. Now the Allies don't have it, now the Germans do. And they have that. I mean, look at the war now, the prime agricultural area. In 1912, Ukraine exported more grains than Canada, Argentina, and the United States combined. It is an incredible, just gorgeous farmland. And so there's going to be an uptick in food prices for us, the whole world, because no one's doing the spring planting. I mean, they're dodging bullets. But anyway, begging your pardon, I was just comparing it to today. But it would have been, and then the Germany would have worked with the Iraqi government and the Shah's government, and they would have met Japan and India.
Okay, I had something ruminating in my head. It's about the the treatment of the kulaks, that was something, right? That was pretty terrible, but the book made it clear that the kulaks weren't using their land efficiently, right? And I suppose if you do own the land, and you're not using it to the best of its ability to meet the German crisis, right? And to industrialize fast enough, that there was very little else you can do except, use of violence in that situation to get the land and put it to the right means. So is that an example of it had to be that way because the kulaks weren't effectively using it, these small owners?
Well, it was yes, but you have to be very careful with the word efficiently or effectively. It wasn't that they weren't producing yields, substantial yields, far beyond what they themselves needed, and then for the crop the next year, the seed for the next year. It was, you couldn't have the mechanization of agriculture if you had small family plots. Tractors, harvesters, reapers don't make sense until you expand the agricultural footprint of the crops. And so the only way for all that mechanization of agriculture to take place is you had to create larger acreage. And that was the collectivization of farms.
But so I was mistaken then, because I thought that the reason they wanted to mechanize farming was because they did not have sufficient production. But you're saying they did have sufficient production. So if they did have sufficient production, why did they need to mechanize farms?
Because they needed to, because then that would create a labor force that had no function. Because instead of one person, or instead of 100 people you need at harvest, you only need one. And so now you have this unemployed agricultural workers who simply have no economic function. You say, hi, come to the cities, work in the factories, the mass production assembly line, because these people don't have all their skills are agricultural and now they're useless. So now they're unskilled when they go to the labor. And there's a second reason. Soviet Union is going to get its foreign exchange from the sale of agricultural and raw material products, primarily energy.
So Russia,
the hard currency to invest in heavy industry.
So Russia before the collectivization was mostly an agrarian society because
God, yes.
Yeah, because that makes it interesting. From what we've seen in the States and in Western Europe is that it was a slow process of getting people into the city and industrialization, right? And the Civil War also stands out because the southern states were agrarian, but then afterwards, because of Reconstruction to an extent, industrialization slowly came in. And so when you have this problem, of the Germans, militarizing and everything's looking terrible, you sort of do have to speed that process along. And even if you have these other hypotheticals like the Duma or the Mensheviks, it's tough to say if they would have been able to been fast enough. Yeah.
Well, the reason why I found this section really interesting is he's not a communist ideologue, right? He's not literally spouting the party line. He's attempting to do a very serious counterfactual analysis of, okay, Stalinism, we don't go there, the 5-year plan, historical alternatives that were possible, not pie in the sky, given Russian history, right? Given Russian traditions, given Russian needs, what would be the possible options? And there's not that many. And his implication is those other, the Menshevik approach, the late Imperial Russian approach, a softer Stalinism. I thought that was a weirdly arresting phrase, which I want to remember. I don't think he says this with any joy. I think he's saying, given the horrendous situation the Soviet Union found itself in 1928, now knowing what we know, that a homicidal maniac Adolf Hitler comes to power in January 33 in Germany and is going to invade Russia, Soviet Union, without a declaration of war in June of 41. Then, yeah, that did seem to make the difference. But I don't think he's happy saying it. I don't think he's saying, this is, we live in a great world because this is true. I think he's deeply bothered by his own analysis.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting, if he's correct in that, you know, part of what I'm always wondering about in all these chapters is, was that the defector going? Is that I'm always wondering, you know, what does this have to do with the general economy? And, you know, with his primary thesis. And I'm wondering if this is like a particularly bad example of what happens when you have conditions that make it, I don't know, I'm not sure how to put this. So, you know, the general economy is always working. I get this feeling I get in the background, but you can have these short-term and localized extreme imbalances, you know, where there is no excess production. And so, and I'm wondering if that's what the story is here. You know, what happens when you get some situation where the general economy is sort of starved out because of decisions that people make, or because of environmental conditions, or because of political and economic conditions. And, you know, because like I was going back and looking at the end of the first chapter, and he was saying things like, well, one reason we have war is because we have this great American excess, and we have these, as you know, and then we have these great deficits everywhere else. And what we really should do is take this American excess and give it to India, or give it to here, give it to there, and maybe we can avoid war by doing that. And you know, so I'm just wondering, how does this fit in? Is he just saying that the need in Russia was so vast that there was just insufficient productivity around the world to fill that gap, or was it that because of political reasons that there were just no one was willing to feed that, you know, to fill that gap? Or I'm just wondering kind of how does, because unlike some of the other chapters, at least in the last few pages, he would kind of bring it around and say, okay, now here's how this is related to the general economy, but I didn't see him do that here.
I think the burden of this chapter, especially this latter half, is he's describing a country that desperately needs capital investment but lacks it. And so what does capitalism look like when there's not a lot of capital around? I mean, we have to think of extreme situations. Look at the South after the Civil War. Really, the only thing they had was land. And then what was invented? Sharecropping, right? I mean, and it makes sense. Sharecropping exists when you have a undercapitalization, and probably that means less global demand for agricultural raw materials, agricultural products and raw materials. And so you kind of have an accordion effect. I mean, we are so monetized in the United States, we forget that so many other parts of the world, they will still literally have a good portion of their goods exchange and barter, right? And also they're squatting. They literally don't have legal title to, I don't know, a 10-foot by 10-foot structure. And so we are so accustomed to a capitalism where there is a lot of capital. And this is going back even before the US Civil War, because of British capital. We don't realize what would capitalism or different capitalisms look like when there's not a lot of capital around. And one could be, you know, the South after the Civil War. One is the Soviet Union, late 20s, early 30s. Another could be a country like Mexico at times.
But with regard to his thesis of the general economy, it seems like he would say that there is always an excess of resources somewhere. And I think that thesis is extremely broad, like in the universe. You know, there is always an excess of resources because, you know, for example, you always have the sun beaming down this ridiculous amount of energy onto the planet. You've got geothermal energy. So in terms of the universe as a whole, there's always an excess of energy. But I wonder if I'm not sure, would he say that then world economic systems also always have an excess and there's always an excess. And
Well, there has to be a certain amount of excess, or you couldn't have new investment.
no, but I mean, I think the general economy does not, the general economy, I think there's a danger in subsuming the general economy under our conceptions of contemporary rationalist capitalist economy, because he thinks the general economy is like this, it seems to me, this universal principle, and that the rational capitalist economy is something that happens when we put artificial restrictions in place, or when there's these imbalances that are forced because of environmental conditions or possibly political conditions. And so, I mean, if I'm understanding him right, I mean, what it seems like he would say is that there was always an excess of resources available, but that, is the Soviet Union a test case for when, again, I'm not even sure how much choice we ever have in this, according to Bataille, but a test case for when we misallocate the excess. Because
But you have to be careful about who is us and we. What I mean is, you can view Russia as its own economy. And even if Bataille is thinking globally, that there's literally a global economic system that in the aggregate is going to have surplus, or, the term you were using, Nevitt, but that doesn't mean you don't have some sets of the system that would be undercapitalized, that whose production isn't anywhere near what it could be.
But when he says general economy, I don't think general economy, the word economy there is not synonymous with political economy. I mean, I think when he says general economy, he's literally talking about a principle of the universe, like the way energy flows through the universe, and the way that, and then, so, the rationalist capitalist economy is an economy in a more restricted sense, a political economy, but you've got this general economy that's happening in the universe, and our rational political economy is ultimately, I think he would say, has to contend with that, because it's like, I see the general economy as kind of like a natural, like gravity or something. It's this system of forces and energies that are flowing through the universe. And, so you can try to build a skyscraper that's sitting on a 1-inch pole, but, physics is going to get you one day. And I think that he thinks that anything you say about human political economy is always should always be interpreted within this framework of the general economy, which is not just a political economy. It's an economy in a
Right.
Almost in the sense of physics.
Right. But what I would say is, I think you're spot on with that analysis. Think of, though, when he gives examples of that general economy functioning, think of, he goes to the Mexico, he goes to Tibet. So it's like he's giving examples, like he's almost like presenting case studies to show how do these very different, I'll just say societies function economically. But still, I thought he used those examples to say that he was correct in his statements about the general economy.
So what, at least in some of the cases, what I saw, like, I think maybe it was the one with the Aztecs, what it seemed to me he was saying, that initially their whole sun worship thing and all of that was working more or less according to principles of the general economy, because they were just throwing out lots of excess. There was very little concern about production and about, all those sort of political economic considerations. But then, and I assumed that, I thought his thesis was, because we are rational creatures, and because we, that we have to think in these sort of limited terms, that over time, and I thought this was what he was tracing through in that chapter, over time, that system that more closely in sync with the sort of general economy shifted into something that was more narrowly economic, and then it shifted again into something that was very narrowly economic, and then it finally shifted into something that we would recognize as a contemporary economic system. And so I thought another one of his sort of implied theses in this book was that it's like there's this constant tug of war between the human tendency to cast things in terms of our sort of narrow economic terms, and then the general economy always kind of comes back in and whomps us because it's just the way the universe works. But then, because the way we work, we're always trying to, it's like the jungle. We're always carving up the jungle, and we're always trying to. But if you take a break, you just take a little bit of break, those damn weeds and jungle creepers are going to come right back in, and that's kind of the sense I got from him.
Just to make a brief, yeah, I agree with you, Nevitt. It's like Eric said, we're going to have to, go at some point. So you either do it somewhere in a way that you can, in some way, understand or incorporate into your life, or you piss the bed. You got to go at some point, and the general economy will come back up. It's like you illustrated that notion of this sort of resurging flux of energy, kind of undulating and breaking through the surface again, like those Afghan societies, those polytheistic tribes and their culture, coming back through the restrictive economizing of Muslim society. But so just a statement on what I think, what I took his statement to be on the Soviet system, and and this is from this reading and from some conversations that I've had with this guy named, I've brought him up a few times to Eric recently. I don't know why. I don't usually talk about this guy this much, but there's a friend of mine named Kent Palmer, who was part of this Discord server, this reading group that I did for a Zizek book, and he talked a lot about Bataille. He was he went to London School of Economics, and he was really big into economics. And he talked really highly of Bataille. And I had a lot of conversations with him, and I've read this book. And from both of those sources, I think that what's happening, or at least what is at least a part of what's going on with this description of the Soviet economy, and what we will get into more, capital, as opposed to the Soviet economy, is to say that our capitalist economy, like you said, Nevitt, like any economy, it's this set of rules and governing principles and patterns that we try to use to formulate a consistently functional and rational society, right? It's always this restriction of that wild, unrestrainable power of the general economy. And so even capitalist economies are that as well. But I think that there is a difference between socialism and communism, or socialism and capitalism, as they relate to the general economy. And the way that I take it is that the Soviet system, or the socialist system, really, this socialism of a country thing, this Soviet experiment or project, is a restricted economy. I think of it as a restricted economy. And yes, all economies are restrictive. I'm going to say that all economies are restrictive, but I would say that, like, within the context of our different multifarious economies on Earth between people, not the general universal energy economy, but in between our economies, it is a restricted economy in the sense that it develops projects and plans and has goals in front of it, and in a miserly fashion establishes a goalpost for which it needs a certain amount of influx of wealth, acquires that wealth, and then closes it off again. And basically is getting just as much as it needs at any given time, and at the same time is always in a state of need, trying to get as much as it can in order to meet these needs and demands that it establishes. And the capitalist economy it's not in line with the general economy necessarily, but I think that it is founded on principles that I would say can sustain themselves much more easily in the face of the action of the general economy. Like it can, and we can call it something of a more general economy. Capitalism is not a general economy, but it's a more general economy. And the Soviet or socialist system is a more restrictive or restricted economy. And so the restricted or socialist system is, like I said, miserly, trying to acquire resources or wealth for its ends and aims. But more general economy of capitalism starts with it's grounded on inequality. It starts on a ground of inequality and no inherent need to fix that, no real desire or impetus to fix that inequality. And so it doesn't have these projects that it needs to fulfill with injections of wealth. It just generates as much as it can, as quickly as it can. And then that flows where it will due to social norms and ends. You know, we used to think child labor was cool, and now we don't, and slavery, things like that, you know. It's like Marx talks about with the commodity that capitalists can sell. The commodity that capitalists sell doesn't really matter. They just want it to turn into more money. They want to use money. They start with money, then they buy some commodities, whatever that is. I don't know, children, slaves, diamonds, sugar, chairs, whatever, and then sells it for more money. But social norms and mores and laws determine what that commodity can be, that thing. And so, I guess I'm just saying, I bring that up to kind of illustrate or to flesh out this point that I think capital does not care about resolving inequality or about what it sells or any sort of, I guess, normative principles like that that might restrict economic flow in both senses of the term. You know what I mean? Economic, but that's what I got out of it. I don't know. That might be off base, but I don't know.
I put this question in the chat, but I'll just ask you, Hunter. So are you saying that the capitalist economy, to put it metaphorically, is more in tune with the general economy in that it allows for and actually sort of incorporates the excess into the economy, whereas the Soviet Union tries to eschew excess and only allows in a little bit of excess here and there when it needs to accomplish its purposes. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Well, yeah, and I think a good example of this would be the capitalist systems. I was about to say the United States because I could just the United States especially is operating on the principles of a system where it produces things like war making, luxurious sex and offshore murder campaigns. It generates or produces or engages in this war making as a result of or in part of the handling of excess. It's this, we've got all this excess and this excess energy, this excess wealth, and we put it into these luxuriating activities and this war making. We expel it out of ourselves, or it expels out into war making. But the Soviet economy or the socialist economy responded to war, needed to get funds in order to make war. The socialist economy needed to raise money or raise resources in order to fund the war. But the capitalist economy more generally goes to a war because it's flush with cash or resources, you know what I mean? And is the socialist economy based on supply and demand? Oh, well, I mean, like
that question was actually to Joseph's question, so I wasn't.
Oh, good.
He had made something about economies being involved with supply and demand, and I was wondering, is that more narrowly capitalist economies, or is that just economies in general?
You still have the component of scarcity in socialism, though, correct?
I mean, that's a genuine question for me. I just didn't. I mean, I thought that was primarily a thing of capitalism, and that at least in command economies, you know, maybe there was a supply and demand, but supply and demand is not a principle that drives the economy as a whole. I thought because there was a control and, you know, a control system that determined how much production you were going to have. I mean, I guess it would still be supply and demand, but rather than being controlled by the individuals, it was controlled by the state. Is that right?
That's exactly right. That's the so-called command economy. So technically the party took on the functions of hundreds of thousands of aggregates of individual producers and consumers, and so made allocative decisions for factories and farms and things like that, and then had expectations of agricultural output.
Maybe perhaps what I should have said is the theme of scarcity is prevalent more so in even capitalist and socialist economic systems. Like for me, what I see from Bataille when I read him is that he's taking a very different economic standpoint than most of any classical economics. Like there's always this aspect, and I use the word supply and demand in the chapter, or an aspect of scarcity in a system. But I'm wondering if what Bataille is doing is approaching it from the perspective that the system itself has excess energy in it by design. So what you do with that excess energy, that waste, is what defines the system.
That sounds basically right to me, although he also seems to say that you can get these local areas of legitimate, I mean, of real scarcity just because of stuff that happens in the world. I guess kind of like happened in the Soviet Union. I'm sorry, Eric, you were gonna.
Oh, I was gonna say, I agree with what you just said, except for that in design, by design part. I want to say, the thesis of the general economy is that none of this, that aspect is not by design. The classic conception of the economy, which is, concerned with scarcity, of probably its chief problem, right? That's why they call it the dismal science. Scarcity is like up there and in its face, and that's where it starts, right? That's classical economics starts with the problem of scarcity. Here's Bataille starting with excess energy, right? And it's just, yeah, I mean, I just to underscore, right? I was agreeing with everything you said there, Joseph, except for the fact that it's by design.
Right.
Call a general economy of by design.
Okay, I probably should use a different word. Yeah, I guess what I meant was less creation and more like the way Bataille looks at nature and says, this is my description of nature, where I see the system inherently has excess energy, but that would probably be a better way to say it.
Hunter, I feel bad because I feel like I cut you off when I.
No, not at all. No, I was just checking a message about the thing tomorrow. But yeah, no, seriously, I didn't coming up at all. I was just also listening in on because I know that well, yeah, I guess to me the most relevant thing that I can think of that's in my mind right now is that, to me, I kind of agree with Eric that or I do agree with Eric. I think that the term general economy, I think, just refers to the propensity of reality to exceed or overdetermine or overcome boundaries or determinations or restrictive economic principles or laws that we try to ascribe to it. It's just the propensity for it to break the bounds of the principles that we try to apply to it, which Hegel would say is pretty cool. That's what I'm thinking about.
So, maybe you already answered this question, Hunter, or maybe somebody else already did. So my question then is, I mean, I feel like I should by now know the answer to this question, but what went wrong in Soviet Russia then? And what went wrong? That's not the right word to put, not what went wrong, but like, if the general economy, this is just another way of asking the question I asked way back, a little while ago. If the general economy is always about there being an excess, then where was that excess in this, when the Soviet Union was going down the toilet? And and why, was there an excess? And if not, where was the general economy? And if there was an excess, where was it, and why didn't it make its way to the Soviet Union?
Well, one answer that I think is plausible is that so much of Soviet capital had to go in to making a war machine to defeat Nazi Germany. And when a country, an economy, however defined, takes surplus and puts it into massive military spending, they have less capital for investment in civilian research and development. And if that becomes chronic, which I think sadly it has in the United States, it means that literally you're going to have decline. Even if you have increases in productivity, you'll have declining rates of increases in productivity. More and more, look at the country of origin of patents, of like, the scientific industrial patents, and the amount of non-US nationals who have US patents has grown dramatically in the last 30 years. And then the less so with US. And whereas in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, maybe even 80s, young people from China and India would come to the United States, get a BA, get a BS, do graduate work, and then stay. And now there's a whole new generation who are saying, nope, after I get my degrees from the USA, I'm going back to China, I'm going back to India. And so I mean, multiply that. It's not just like 3 people, but multiply this for multiple years. And so for me, it was the Soviet Union simply was, I don't want to use a cliche, was an impossible situation. And it had to put all of that capital into military spending for sheer survival. And then remember, look how far Germany reached. The German army could hear the church bells in Moscow from where they were, how close they got to the capital city. And so Soviet Union had pushed them all the way back, which took them from roughly January 1st, 43 to June of 44, just to regain their own territory.
But I mean, it seems to me that's still talking within a restricted economy, because we're saying, well, the Soviet Union, why did they have to do this? But the thesis of the general economy is, again, very broad. And if the general economy always has an excess of resources, then that should suggest that there were resources elsewhere in the world. And I mean, Grant, and so that's why, I'm just kind of figuring out what is he saying here? Is it that there were excess resources, but because of these artificial political and economic boundaries, they were unable to flow where they needed to flow? In other words, like they were in the West, and we wouldn't give them to them because we hated them? Or I'm just wondering if the general economy thesis is correct. It would seem like these resources would have to be, this excess would have to be somewhere.
No, you nailed it. What you said as a kind of hypothesis was exactly what happened in historic time. After, when the Cold War started and the United States ceased to see the Soviet Union as an ally, Congress passed a series of laws. It applied the Smoot-Hawley tariff to the Soviet Union and its satellites. It did not permit. There was also, and so that negatively affected trade massively. There were restrictions on capital that could be sent to the Soviet Union, and there were also very severe limits on trade. So the United States was literally trying to isolate the Soviet Union and its European satellites, thinking that would starve the Soviet economy of the necessary capital and goods that it needed to continue to grow.
I also want to say, I think there's what counts as excess is going to be a relative term. If we're perfectly happy to maintain an agrarian society, then we don't need to build factories, we don't need to build railways, we don't, what I mean. So anything in abundance of what we grow or produce is excess that we can enjoy, right, through expenditure, or we can build monasteries, yada yada. If we're content to maintain this level of productivity and society keep ticking along at the in this fashion, and then I think one of the points is that the points of this chapter is to kind of like contrast it to the previous chapter, to make sense of what socialism aspires to, and which is to it's supposed to be a complete contrast with the previous chapter, but with the picture we get with still Soviet industrialization is that in many respects it resembles the previous chapter, and that needs to be explained because socialism is supposed to be a reaction to the dehumanizing effects of capitalism, right? So, you know, from the transition to the medieval world to the, you know, the modern world with its Protestant ethic and industrialization and the growth of capitalism, all of this excess is now, you know, what counts as excess is what we don't really need right now immediately to eat and breathe and reproduce physically, right? So all of that gets invested back into the system to grow the productive capacity of the system, because that's how capitalism works, and that's how, you know, capitalists get richer and richer. It wasn't necessarily, you know, to grow the productive capacity of the system for the sake of growing the capacity of, you know, growing the total productive capacity of the system. It was thousands of agents for their own, you know, with their own initiative and their own incentives, you know, just trying to see that their investments grow. But all of these agents trying to ensure that their investments grow means that we have the system that constantly reinvests whatever it doesn't need, you know, it's whatever it can call as excess, all right, reinvest it back into the system to grow the capacity of the system. And in that chapter, Bataille is kind of saying, you know, human beings were dehumanized, especially working people who were, you know, again, they were just given, you know, especially in the middle of the 19th century, right? They were just given, you know, basic sustenance levels of food and housing, and not much more than that, despite all of the productivity that they personally did, right? It was very austere. And it was what value was in excess of what they produced was just reinvested back into the national system, right, or the national economy in order to grow the productive capacities of it. But here, human beings are still treated like things. We have all this excess that we're not actually using. It's just going back into the system. This is a problem. We're dehumanizing ourselves. Well, but socialism is supposed to be a solution, right? It's supposed to be a new system where whatever we produce in excess of our immediate needs can be distributed to enjoyment instead of accumulation, right? And then what Bataille is trying to explain in this chapter is that, yeah, actually the Soviets had to do some kind of accumulation. Contrary to all the dreams of the socialists living in the West, Russia was in a special situation, right? Now you know, so like to, you know, I guess answer, you know, kind of what question you put it, the way you put it earlier, Nevitt, like strictly speaking, you can say, yes, they still had excess energy, right? Like the Soviets were still making more food, you know, that for most of the time, right? During this period, they're still making enough food to feed everybody. But what did they do above and beyond that to make sure that everybody had nice, humane conditions of living and could enjoy art and, you know, only work 4-hour days and, you know, whatever. They didn't do that. They couldn't do that because they had to accelerate the growth of their economy to increase its productive capacity, because where they were at that stage in history, they were very vulnerable. They could, you know, again, they had a long history of Western European countries threatening them. And right after their revolution, there were all sorts of hostile acts from Western countries and the United States trying to isolate them. And so they knew, and I guess to, you know, answer, you know, part of the question where Ed threw out early on is, you know, it's strange that Bataille didn't, he didn't, you know, because in the end it's justified. It's justified because what history showed us, they were just barely able to beat back the Germans. Ed pointed out it's strange that you know, that was the historical justification, but Bataille never really drives that point home, that it was the Nazis who proved that Stalin had to do what he had to do. And I think part of the reason for that is from the perspective of the Soviets leading up to that, and that, you know, the 2 5-year plans leading up to that period, was that it may have been the Germans, it may have been anybody else. They just knew they were very vulnerable, that they were backward. They didn't have the productive capacity to keep up and fend off any invasions, whether it was British, French, German, or anybody else. And then it just happened as a matter of contingency that it was the Germans, right? But I just to kind of answer, you know, a way of answering Ed's earlier question way back, he's right? In the end, according to Bataille's argument, in the end, it was the German invasion which proved that the Soviets had to be austere, and they couldn't realize the dreams of the Western socialists to redistribute this excess in a more humane way, because they were backward, and they really, you know, backward, not as industrialized as they wanted to be, and not able to fend off a major attack, right? But again, they had to do what they had to do. in order to extend the productive capacities of the system. And I also wanted to say, like, I think Ed's right too. A lot of that had to go back into the military sector, but I think Bataille also made a big point about heavy industry, which a lot of that feeds directly into military, but also supports his other point about the collectivization of agriculture. Because I think it was in the same context. It was because the Soviets invested so much in heavy industry as opposed to light industry that they had to have larger plots for each crop. Had they invested just as much in light, or considerably more into light industry, than they could have made smaller tractors that small families could have done with their farms, but they didn't do that. They were more interested in investing in heavy industry than light industry, and that's why they needed greater collectivization in the agriculture. And it just, again, it's this idea that they really had to enforce brutal measures just to get themselves to a position where they could fend off an attack should they be attacked. And then lo and behold, history tells us that those brutal measures were, vindicated.
So would Bataille say then that
That was very well said.
would Bataille say that I don't know what to call it, the magic of capitalism is that it takes that excess and converts it into, so is it a continuous process of converting the excess into the limited, or rolling it back into the limited economy, so that no matter how much excess you develop, you're always in a sense you're always using it. So it's constantly converting excess into use. Whereas maybe in a true Marxist society, maybe you would not do that. You would not convert the excess into use. You would convert the excess into a better form of living for the people, or something like that. Does that sound right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. I would refine it maybe like, under a capitalist system, whatever excess goes back into the capitalist system with the capitalist values. Under a Marxist system, whatever excess goes into it, on paper, or ideally goes into humane values, right? Rather than capitalist values of recirculation of sources to expand the capacity for growth or production.
Well, earlier, Bataille made this distinction between use and waste. And, maybe when it gets this complicated, maybe he would drop that distinction, but that's why I was using the word use. It's like the capitalist economy continually converts excess into useful stuff. So it never wastes anything, because it's always being turned back into the utilitarian machine of capitalist economy. Whereas, maybe, I don't know, but based on, what you were saying, that thing that Marx says about, being a worker in the morning and an artist later and so on, that maybe he would say that ideal is more consistent with wasting the excess, in terms of you're not trying to reharness it back for useful purposes. Yeah. But then the Soviet, because of their particular conditions, environmental, political, and economic conditions, they were never able to get to that point. So they just, like you said, they never got to the point where they actually had a meaningful excess.
Right. Not enough to waste. Everybody should be allowed to waste some resource, right? Everybody should be able to waste their time from time to time, right? Everybody should be able to waste some food every once in a while, right? We should, in those terms, right, between use and waste, right? I think that fits.
Yeah. I mean, compare this to China when it was finally getting its economic act together in the, late 1980s. Soviet Union is falling apart. The United States is very open to trading with China because it's making all these economic reforms, but not one little tiny political reform. But because of its turn to the market or markets, it's like, oh my God, this is a great new day in Chinese history. Yeah, and how many Communist Party presidents have they had since then? But anyway, China was incredibly fortunate in terms of the international environment. The Soviet Union was declining and then simply disappeared. The United States, the other superpower, great economy, didn't view China as a threat. And look at how long that lack of threat perception persisted. And look at the amount of investment from the United States and Britain and some Western European countries into China. And now China is exporting, to say vast is like saying Jupiter is large. I mean, there are literally multi-trillion-dollar transportation projects that China has implemented. I don't know, has it been 10 years? And it's foreseen to go into the future, at least for the next 30. Just signed an agreement a couple of years ago with Italy, created high-speed rail between Addis Ababa and the capital of Djibouti, if I'm not mistaken, and cut the travel time. What was it? Do you remember, Eric or Joseph or anyone? Was it cut the travel time by 2/3? I mean, it's hours instead of days. And they have these massive projects. And we're arguing over financing a wall.
Yeah, very much a capitalist economy, right? How many, trillions of dollars in that Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
And again, it's supposed to pay off in the end, right? It's for more growth, right? It's not just invested so that people can waste it. It's not a giant ferry wheel for the people of Afghanistan to jump on, or whatever. It's supposed to rebuild the Silk Road, right? More or less, and extend it into Africa. And China benefited hugely from the Silk Road centuries ago. So why not revive that idea? This ocean trade really favors the British and Americans, right? This land trade, though, if we build something like a new Silk Road.
Eric, though, did you hear something I stumbled over? Sri Lanka signed an agreement with China. China is going to build a port in Sri Lanka, and it's going to be given, I believe, a lease for, I don't know what percent of that new harbor, for 99 years. They're doing a Hong Kong.
Right. Yeah, no, I've heard a lot of people accuse the Belt and Road as a new form of colonialism, or it's Chinese imperialism. And there's arguments about to what extent that's a fair description.
Yeah.
I'm not taking sides here. I don't know.
You do you, I'll do me.
I hear good sides on, good arguments on both sides, and I don't know enough, right? But
my experience with the president of China, he's come across as a reasonable man.
I looked into Xi's eyes. I saw a cold.
Yeah, I looked into his eyes and saw his soul. Get a room. When President Bush said that, I was embarrassed for the country. If a Democratic president had said that about a Russian, how do you think the Republicans, what different organs would they have ruptured? Hearing a Democratic president saying he looked into the eyes of a Russian president and saw his soul. They would have impeached the poor son of a bitch. Sorry, I have a visual memory, and I remember that press conference, and I was like, no.
What if he said instead that he met Xi, didn't know, no soul seeing or nothing like that, but I knew that he was the kind of guy I'd drink a beer with, and that was all I needed to know that he was the one I wanted in charge. Republicans would be behind that, I think.
Yeah, it would be. That would be less intense. Yeah.
I think on the note of just really quick, because I'm glad you had something to say, Nevin, because I'm just talking. But on the note of China, I just think, I guess I think I was thinking about was I would be really interested in seeing what a strictly Bataillean analysis would say about, because this was written at a time where, like he says, the Soviet Union has the potential to overcome America. And that was true. that really was the case at the time. It was like, and I mean, it always had that, but I mean, not always. No, that's not true. But it for a while, it really did. It was a part of this moment, where this alternative way of life was just seemingly stable, or at least, at the very least, functional, and a threat to things like American expansionism or whatever. But I just wonder about a contemporary, like, okay, post fall of the Soviet Union, now we've got the experiment of Chinese communism, which I've heard some people describe it as capitalism with Asian characteristics, and nothing to do with Asian people, but a series of political systems that I think kind of blossomed out of Singapore, was a big hub of right-wing industrial revolution of technology and development of infrastructure, and that this sort of model of wild capitalism. Why I would call it wild capitalism, constrained by a state apparatus that kind of doesn't really constrain it in the sense that it keeps it from going wild. It just kind of siphons all of its excess stuff that it shoots off of itself. It's like, getting all the trimmings, and then disseminating that, or dispersing that to the countryside and investing into the coast. I just wonder what Bataille would say about that. What is, because I have that impression. That is my current impression of the Chinese. It's so hard to talk about the Chinese economy and the Chinese political system, because it's so two things. First off, it really is, I mean, ambiguous in a lot of ways as to what people mean when they say what they say in positions of power in our government, just as much as another government like the Chinese Communist Party, and to what degree there might be the general perception of party cadres or whatever of big Communist Party leaders who happen to be embezzling money or lining their pockets or whatever. That's a common, I think, pop culture idea, is that, you're the bureaucratic state official and you're siphoning money off the people. But then we also have to admit that the possibility of old partisans in the party who have commitments to the communist system or really believed in something and felt genuine remorse when there was the news of the Communist Party's quashing of student revolutions for worker unions in China. There's at least some room for that to be a possibility. So it's hard to talk about what, it's hard to put a pin in a lot of things that are happening, especially also given our distance and lack of direct or immediate information. And finally, and then the third reason, I guess, would be that people in the West, where we are engaging in this discussion, have extremely impassioned and very differing opinions about the Chinese Communist Party and their political system and their economic system. So it's hard to have to be willing to make statements about it, or even descriptive, even strong descriptive statements. But I guess the sense that I illustrated, I guess, was my sense of it, that it's wild capitalism organized by some sort of state apparatus. At least that's the impression that I got from a couple of books that I read about China when I was really interested in China a couple of years ago. But I just don't. I wonder. I guess is that just a new attempt at answering the problems of excess? And in a sense, is it maybe like the most effective and in a sense potentially most dangerous iteration of our existing knowledge of possible systems, where we know about socialism, we know about communism, we know about this, that, and based on our pool of knowledge, some of the strongest or sharpest and most, like I said, potentially most dangerous, in that they are so effective, that is dangerous. Not in the sense that they're effective at, like Bataille describes as his goal, in that, like, bettering the well-being or our livelihoods of all people, or to point to something like sympathies that I've really focused on with Eric, anti-war sentiment or peace building in any sort of sense. Not really effective in that sense, but it gets people resources. It gets people grains and water and electricity extremely effectively, and that can win support very effectively. And that's where a lot of people come from. Michael Parenti, a very popular Western leftist thinker, who I think is really smart. I think he had a lot of really good things to say. I think he was a really, really, really smart guy. I mean, he's still alive. But and I've watched, I was inspired by his lectures when I was a young person, or younger person than I am now. But at the same time, he does make certain points that I can object to, or at least that I feel like I, some reason to object to, like the support for the reduction of poverty as the primary operating goal of a governing body. And that's not to say that he's necessarily saying that is the primary goal or end or aim that should be of a governing body, but that it is good reason enough to at least consider supporting that government of that system, which I think is a very good point. And it gives weight to people here who would say, it's not wild capitalism being constrained by a state apparatus. That is an unfair illustration or rendition of the People's Party. It's really this liberatory effort for the advancement of all people out of poverty and into the future or something. And they point to cases like, look, all these people who were peasants one generation ago now have iPhones or something. You know what I mean? And that's what I mean when I say effective. And what I would say, I am willing to say, and it's so horrible because I'm saying it from a position where I'm speaking into a laptop in a room full of books, and I have this little vape, and I've just got surrounded by comforts and luxuries. And from my nice cushy little chair in my nice cushy little apartment, I can wag my finger and make statements like, I don't think that poverty reduction is a sufficient, aspect of a specific system, a particular system, to justify it. If it comes with a caveat that we might not prefer, like some of the social problems that some people point at when they talk about the Chinese economic system. So yeah, I feel like I have no room to talk on it, but I so want to. And I want somebody else to, somebody who's really into Bataille and is really full of themselves and just doesn't care. Wind on my back, I'm gonna take you all on. Here's my statement. I want them to arise, and tell me what's what, and I will sit and listen and not voice my support or denunciation too loudly. Yeah.
You will sit and listen to someone retort you on Bataille. Yeah, I'm gonna call bullshit on that one.
I would think that Bataille, I'm guessing, I would defer to you all. You seem to have read more about him and of him. But if, following what Nevid said earlier, if there is a kind of inner logic to a general economy, and at least some of the manifestations of that general economy within specific historical economies, then China is in a very interesting case because of the sheer size of their economic growth for decades, right? I mean, you might have Brazil 10% growth rate a year for 5 years, but China has been in double digits for at least 20 years, and so with the growth of the Chinese economy and with the continued centralization of the government, China doesn't think of the United States. We have 50 states. They have some degree of economic regulatory authority, right? Even though we are a common market and a free trade area, the United States still has these smaller units that can actually interfere with production, distribution, and exchange. China doesn't have that. China literally has
Rest in peace, headphone users.
No, it's just I thought the phone was already the ringer was already down. Was what I was saying making any sense? That China seemed to be the ironically enough, communist China is the best example of capitalist production ever, because there's so little other things that are interfering with capitalist decisions for the growth of the economy. Right? I mean, look at it. There's Confucianism is not a barrier. It's a one-party state. No country can really lean on it to change its opinion on public policy. It has had an impressive growth rate and an increase in Chinese prestige. And this has been the most prosperous that China has been in for at least centuries. It might be longer than that. And so, of course, nothing succeeds like success. And so they're going to keep on going back. And that's frankly why I think some of their leadership actually views political protests as literally bad for business. I mean, it's interfering with the free flow of capital, labor, and the land market. And it just, we don't have time for this bullshit. We're trying to grow a continental sized economy. I don't agree with that sentiment. I'm saying I think that's the ethos of the Chinese government.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's the current state capitalism in China is probably, one of the best glittering examples of capitalism and what it can do when unimpeded by other forces like democracy.
Yeah, I've heard some talk from, well, okay. I've watched and I've listened to a talk by Zizek where he talks about that democracy and capital do seem to be tending away from each other in that both seem to produce problems for the other, capital getting in the way of the sort of basic principles of our idea of democracy, and democracy kind of getting in the way of some of the more potentially lucrative endeavors of capital. And I thought that was really interesting. And he talked about that a lot in his book, Pandemic, COVID-19 Shakes the World, which was decent. It's not that good. If you've never read anything by him, it's bright and pink, and that might draw you in like that did for me. It was such a bright book cover. I liked it, but it was not that good. It was decent. And I'm willing to say that about my hero. Okay.
What really drew me into Zizek was his immediate affinity to John Carpenter's They Live. I was like, okay, this man and I'm going to enjoy reading and listening to him speak.
It lives.
Oh, one of hands down my favorite Carpenter films, next to I don't know, Prince of Darkness has to be my second one from the 80s. I love that one with
Wait,
Carpenter.
you're not going to say The Thing? That's so shocking. I don't know, man. I just like
I love The Thing. I love The Thing, and I think it's an exceptionally good film, but as part of his Apocalypse trio, Prince of Darkness is up there, and I just thought They Live had him so ostracized from Hollywood for the statements that he made with it. Believe me, The Thing is exceptional, and I love it. The board game is really good too, by the way, but that will also cause conflicts and fights. But for me, it's got to be Prince of Darkness and They Live.
I was weaned on Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. So what happened is, I have no idea how this happened. I was 10 years old. They show Psycho on the old-fashioned CBS or NBC affiliates in Chicago. I was in the house by myself. That was rare, me being 10 years old. So I don't know where the parental units and my sister were. So I turn it on because I like movies. So I turn it on, and I still remember Norman, mother blood. It's like, oh, this doesn't sound like she's bleeding. Something sounds really weird. When Psycho became too scary, I would change the station and watch Mark Twain Tonight. That was Hal Holbrook pretending he was Mark Twain. And when that got boring, I went back to Psycho, and that's how I spent my evening.
I was raised by a single mother who was a teacher and was exhausted and stressed all the time. So I watched a lot of TV, babysat myself, and my faves were The Outer Limits and Twilight Zone. And then after Twilight Zone, Night Gallery, because it was hosted by the same guy. And now Night Gallery, I literally gave myself nightmares because I would watch it late at night and it was super creepy. And then I would go to bed and have nightmares, but whatever.
They had a show called Chilly Billy, who would host it in Pittsburgh, and he would show horror movies at 11 o'clock. So I would always stay up and sneak them and then get terrified. But I have to go a little early tonight, gentlemen. I really appreciate the all conversation, your company. So thank you yet again. Farewell.
I hope just until later.
Yeah. Actually, we only have two. Actually, I was going to say something about it. We've only got 2 more meetings on this book, on the last chapter, and then 3 more meetings in the literature on Billy Budd, and then that's the end. So I think that's right. Isn't that right, Hunter? I think there's just 3 more meetings, and so if we need to, we're going to have to figure out at some point whether we're going to meet during the summer and it, both philosophy, literature, and if so, what we're going to read. And we could do the same thing that we've been doing recently, where somebody proposes something, a book or 2, and we just kind of by acclamation pick one, or we could do the thing where we make suggestions and then vote on them. So I'm not at all saying we need to do that tonight. I'm just kind of like, that's a heads up. Usually those seminars start at the last week in May, something like that, after classes are done and grades are done, and we've had a bit of a breather. So anyway, just heads up.
I'm available for summer. I would love to continue meeting in summer if you guys are. So I can commit to that.
So, okay. See you, Joseph.
Take care. Bye, gentlemen.
So I remember why I was hoping Hunter would be here.
Oh yeah.
Because
I was going to ask that.
he makes a little comment on Hegel at the bottom of page 151. So he says, let's see, the Soviet, to get a little bit of context, I don't want to read the whole paragraph. I'll just read a few sentences, a quarter up from the bottom. The Soviet Union, on the contrary, is a framework in which any nation can be inserted. It could later incorporate a Chilean republic in the same way as a Ukrainian republic is already incorporated. This way of thinking is not opposed to Marxism. It is different, however, in that it gives the state the preponderant and definitive place that Hegel gave it. Man, as defined by the Hegelian idea, is not an individual, but the state. The individual has died in it. It has been absorbed into the higher reality and into the service of the state. In a wider sense, the statesman is the sea into which flows the river of history. Insofar as he participates in the state, man leaves both animality and individuality behind him. He is no longer separate from the universal reality. So one, I was just wondering what Hunter thought about that. And then 2, actually this came up a little earlier in a sort of tangential way, the role of, or the lack of role of, the individual in general. I mean, you do get the sense like when the Soviet Union was going through its problems, he says, kind of like, fuck the individual, we've got to save the nation. And then, today capitalism doesn't really care about the individual unless you happen to be the 1% or maybe the 10%. So anyway, just the in general, what is the role of the individual vis-a-vis the general economy? And then I was curious as to how Hunter would react to these comments on Hegel. And maybe Ripley, if, I don't know if Ripley's is also a Hegel fanboy, so I don't know.
Also, fangirl.
I am so sorry, Ripley. I have made that mistake so many
Okay.
times. I apologize. I will try to do better.
Okay. So, I mean, I recently, I was recently in a seminar with Eric and some of his friends that I met through him. I it was just to talk about Hegel. It was on Thursday night. It was yesterday. And I left early because I was tired and I needed to go to bed because I thought I would be leaving today. I actually thought I wouldn't be here today for this seminar, but because I thought I was going on a little weekend vacation that turns out to not be happening today, only tomorrow. It was a oopsie. But anyway, so I participated in that seminar and now I'm here. Which we're all very excited about. But it reminded me, that seminar, just how much, I don't know, like I find Bataille is difficult for me. And Hegel was difficult for me before in a completely different way. In the sense that Hegel, I feel like I can just kind of go like for a lot longer. Maybe that's, I don't know, maybe that's an indication of familiarity or understanding or something, but with Hegel, I can go for a lot longer. And so I will try not to, but just on the notion of the individual's role and this, that's what's at question. That's what's in question here in this section where he's talking about Hegel's notion of the individual, the individual man as defined by the Hegelian idea being not an individual but the state. And I was thinking I almost wanted to go back into just my notes on the phenomenology of spirit, back to the section on mutual recognition, and start talking about the concept of mutual recognition and how that kind of operates. But to kind of cut to the quick, I think that when Bataille says that man in Hegel's idea is not individual, I think it's a very astute observation. I think it's very, it may seem at first, this is my initial impression was that it was very traditional. It was a very traditional reading of Hegel. That he was reading Hegel as being this rigid, dogmatic, idealist, absolute idealist, that sort of like a Russell interpretation of Hegel. But you should, by the way, Ripley, in response to your message on the chat, you should. Everybody should. Actually, that's not true. If you value your personal mental fortitude or sanctity or coherence, don't. But if you don't give a fuck about anything, sure, it's fun. I don't know. But my point is, I would say that I'm willing to agree with Bataille. I'm willing to agree with Bataille's reading of Hegel, and I would say it's in fact rather astute, because with readings like this, where we think of or where we might think that it's sort of this stuffy, traditionalist reading of Hegel, where he's incorporating all people into this amalgamate end of history project, unfolding dialectical realization of the absolute or whatever in our society, and the organic body of the state. I was in a class recently where we were talking all about how Hegel was the big progenitor of the idea of an organic state body, which I disagree with. But my point is, I want to say first off, I agree with I'm just going to say that I agree with the notion that, that individuals aren't that important. I think that it hurts me to say that, because I very much value my stupid little life and my personal thoughts and feelings and my personality and what I give to the system or to society, and what's my role, and am I a good person, and am I beautiful or something, and all these anxieties and worries and self-doubts and whatever. And then for me to say things like, or to hear people like Hegel put forward, and then to hear Bataille echo it back, that when we talk about an individual or a person, Hegel doesn't talk about individuals until like 3/4 of the way through phenomenology. And when he does, he talks about the singular individual. And it's a very qualified, and compared to, or relative to a lot of other discussions in the book, a relatively brief discussion. He's just like, okay, if you really got to talk about it, we'll talk about it. Here's what the position of the singular individual as we talk about it. This is kind of where it stands. But even when he does that, his approach to it is so laden with this series of universal concepts that when he says the singular individual, right, it's both in our minds, we conjure the image of the singular person, the individual, and it's the singular individual, all things that are singular and individual, kind of in this immanent dual meaning that I think is really cool. But more to the point, I think that the singular individual, to kind of get to why I'm saying all this, is to say that the singular individual, when we talk about it, is like Hegel kind of points out or illustrates in the Phenomenology of Spirit, it's through this set of universal tools. And the battleground for the fate or our description or analysis of the singular individual, that the battleground for that debate or for that discussion or for these concepts to work themselves out, I think that Hegel would say that it largely, if not wholly, I would, in fact, like entirely takes place in the realm of universals. That the realm of the description and analysis and unfolding of the life of the singular individual occurs in the realm of universals. And that is evinced through his choice of language and through statements like the one that Bataille is making, where he says that man is not an individual here, but the state. I would say that one word that I would add, just to make it a little bit more palatable to our ears for Bataille, to this Bataille sentence, I would say man as defined by the Hegelian idea is not a mere individual, but the state. Now, I think those are two very different statements. I think he's really going far and saying, like, in the Hegelian idea, man is not an individual, but the state. Because when Hegel talks about man or mankind or humankind or, whatever, the unfolding that's occurring, that's at the center of his thought, is not a singular person. Like I'm just some guy, and I'm full of these like problems and inconsistencies, and I am not a very, but and that's fine and dandy, but I am not an interesting subject of analysis. That's, I think, the problem, is that I am not an interesting or productive object of analysis. You can look inside me and you will find vacuous shit and meaningless platitudes and like smells that I remember from my grandma's house when I was in the second grade and stuff, and like whatever. You could dig around all you want, you'll find meat and bones and stupid memories and inconsistent beliefs. But if you want to try to engage with this notion of the singular individual as at all, this man, the man or the woman or the person in the state, the statesman, if you want to contend with that idea, it takes place in this realm, I guess, this realm of logical operation that focuses on the state as the expression of human will, which is an extension of an idea. It's like an extension of an idea that Eric and I were talking at length about. I was in the last seminar, or in the seminar last night with Eric, I was teasing out some questions from some of the friends that were also in attendance about the unity of being and the I, the unity of the I and being the category, right? And then what happens when, if we can just kind of pretend that we all get that, and that's totally cool, because I'm going to do that. I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to pretend that I have a totally good, I've read Kant, sure, that's a lie, but again, we're playing pretend. I can say, okay, the unity of being and I, let's just, okay, yes, it's 393 in the Phenomenology of Spirit, but don't worry about that. This thing, this I in being, like Kant says, operates on a couple fundamental principles or presuppositions like time and space. These categories, these categories of being, I guess, right? Because it's the unity of the I in being. But I mean, not necessarily just mere being or whatever. That's again, I'm really trying to get to be succinct without missing key details. But that's so like almost impossible. But my point is, when you have this I in unity with being as the category, right? Time and space, think of things like that. What does that unity do but expand those categories. What do those categories look like in the dialectical interplay between the I and the being, right? What occurs in that unfolding, but the extension of that category, that unity of I and being the category, it doesn't stop at the category. It's not that humans discovered the notion of time and space, or sure, forms of sensuous intuition, or categories. What these categories, right? What does it do but see those categories outside of itself, rather than just saying, okay, we get time and space. We figured out that there is time and there is space, and or there is math and there is reason and there is fire and there is gods and there is wind, and we're chill now. No, people were like, let's analyze that. Let's start putting it out there. Zeno, let's give it I can catch a turtle easily, I can, and so people were like, that's not a law. That's a fun little riddle, but that's not a law. And so these, like, so my point is, it's the extension or the expansion and the continuation of the unfolding of categories, the unity of being and I giving rise to law, or laws. And what are laws, or where do laws exist? But in some sort of formal communal agreement on some principle or understanding or concept, like a state. So our very engagement, the will of our unity and our dialectical engagement with being is expressed or able to be, at the very least, remarked on in a very, if we want to be the most like disconnected we can, to be the most modest principle possible, at the very least we can get like plain-faced, extremely insightful looks into that operating dialectical relationship through an analysis of the laws that stand as a result of that relationship. Right? We can look, it's kind of like a tracker in the woods, it's like, oh, there was some creature here and I can tell by its footprints or its dung or something. We can kind of get a look at what people are like based on what they've done, which means a lot of, at least in this sense, these laws and so on. So I think there's real weight. I think there's real serious weight to this claim by Bataille. That whole thing was to say, and maybe I was trying to convince myself that Bataille is not a reactionary. He's not saying Hegel is evil, but he's making, I think, an accurate and legitimate point about Hegel. That does not necessarily mean that Hegel was an authoritarian who thought that all people should goose step to the tune of the state. And if you're an individual and you say no, fuck you, that doesn't matter. I don't care. You're not the state. You're just an individual. It's not to say that. It's not to say that. But I think that in this sense, it makes sense, given the thing he's talking about being this what does he call it? Socialist imperialism or imperial socialism? Yes. We're in the notion of imperial socialism arises for Bataille out of a recognition of the necessity of a universal empire or state. We have a will, and it's a very natural one too. We have a will and it's towards freedom, and we see freedom as X. Well, if we're going to get to that, we need to basically have the entire earth under our control, in a sense, or in agreement that that's chill. We need everybody to agree to get along with this journey for freedom, or this mission for freedom, or this realization of freedom, or whatever, this communist dream of freedom. And so it's a recognition of the necessity of a universal empire or state, which is, I think, fine within the brunt of ethical systems at large. The point of ethics is to say that what I believe is right. And if you believe that, then if somebody else says, no, I think something else is right, it's reasonable within the ethical system to say, I think you're wrong. And what that means is I'm right. And you guys should believe what I believe because I'm right. That's again, I'm being shorthanded, but so that was kind of the realization of imperial socialism, and in its willingness to incorporate things like Chilean and Ukrainian republics and incorporating these satellite states, it kind of embodies that recognition of the necessity of a universal empire, recognition of the necessity of a universal empire, in a sense, for the sake of an ethical edifice. If the goal is an ethical edifice's advancement against the grain of existing politics or law, there's a necessity for a universal empire or state in the name of that ethical edifice. And that mission is embodied in the imperial practice of the socialist project of the USSR, which in a way kind of operates on the logic of incorporating all men into the universal reality of statesmanship, being members of the state. You know, and a great illustration of this. Okay, one more thing. When Hitler would say a speech, he would stand up and then go like this: "Thank you, I'm Hitler. Thank you. My speech was. I appreciate." They would be applauding. "Woo! You know, we love you." And he would say, "Thank you. I appreciate it. I worked really hard on that speech. Thank you." But Stalin did something very different. When he would give a speech, he would stand up and everybody would start clapping, and he would kind of clap with them. Be like, "Yeah, isn't that great? Isn't it awesome what we're doing? Aren't we?" It's not me up here, folks. It's the ideas, you know. It's just the march of history. You know, I'm just a servant of the march of progress in history. It's not me, you know. It's a full subsumption into this notion of individuals joining the state in universal reality as engines of the motive force of history. Anyway, yeah.
You would not have wanted to have been the first person to stop applauding. Even if you pass out that your arms are so sore, you will not stop applauding. That's my addendum to your comment about the dynamics of public speaking by Stalin.
Yeah, I wanna, yes, that's a very good point. I don't think that this performance of Stalin's was done in good faith. I don't know if that's that controversial though, to proclaim.
Oh, that was almost British understatement. I don't think it was being done in good faith. I'm gonna have to write that down. That was good.
This is a more simplistic thinking on the individual, but you know, what political system valorizes the individual more than any other? Well, I would guess ours does, but you know, because it's all about, you know, at least in some construals, it's all about individual rights, and the only purpose of the state is to guarantee individual rights. So, you know, we are not one of those collectivist states. We are all about the individual. But I don't, you know, of course, nobody that says that would really think that carefully about what they're saying, but the word individual is so this is sort of my Hegelian, my weak Hegelian insight. The word individual is a universal. You know, the very term individual is a universal. And so and you know, maybe Kierkegaard would agree with this, the only true experience of the individual is pure subjectivity. Because as soon as we engage in any kind of social interaction, the individual is no longer a mere individual. The individual is a social person. And so, you know, I think that the individual as a social entity I think that's the individual is a social entity for any kind of state. And in fact, not states, but for any kind of social organization. And so, you know, I don't, like I said, I have a really hard time. I'm convinced by Hunter and Eric and others that Hegel is very important, but I don't understand him very well. But I think he's working on something profound there, trying to finesse this distinction between individual and universal, because I don't think that I think it, I mean, just conceptually, there's just, you know, a bare individual is meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. So anyway, not terribly profound, but
just a fun party trick whenever you want to convince people that you're a Hegelian. and you say, okay, check it out. Dialectics is like the two opposite things being in the same thing, right? Okay, how about this? The most general possible statement and the most specific possible statement all at once. I am here with you right now. Whoa, anybody could say that at any time about anything. But I'm saying it about here right now with you. That's as specific as we're going to get. And that's the most broad possible. That is the most open-ended, nondescript statement possible. But yeah.
I want to say that's that takes us all the way back to sense certainty, doesn't it?
Well, when you say this,
Here,
just this,
now.
yeah.
Well, you see, the thing that Hegel didn't think of was that I'm certain. I'm 100% absolutely certain that I'm here right now with all of y'all in my little computer. I'm totally, yeah. But, you know, I read the book when I was a freshman. It was decent, you know, I kind of skimmed through it, you know, so, but I think I got it. You know, I think I got the basic points.
I am not at all certain that I am here now. I don't know. You're insufficiently critical and skeptical. One, I'm not sure I'm an I. Two, I'm not sure what here and now means. So good
Now
for you.
you're really getting it, you know. Now you're really getting it. That's you're getting a sense of. See, you're a Hegelian already. You're a natural. You know, come on.
Try writing it down now, right? Yes, I'm here now. What happens to it when you write it down?
You're not there anymore. And you're not you anymore. That's the problem. Well, we digress into things that will make us insane. So
I think it would take some effort, though. I think
Yeah.
we're far enough away from it. We're okay.
I'm sure most of you have heard this story before. When I was in graduate school, I was talking to one of my professors who we developed a nice relationship. He died not that many years ago. He was an older guy, but I once complained about, I said, this stuff is driving me crazy. And he looked at me and said, no, only the good ones go crazy. And it wasn't, or no, only the really smart ones go crazy. And it wasn't until I walked out of his office that I realized that was a slight. It's like, well, shit.
But you see, no, the inversion is that it was a compliment. You're on your way. You're
I'm on my
feeling
way to insanity.
You can see the light starting to blind you. That's good. Yes, you're starting to lose your grip. Fantastic. We're making some progress. By George, I think he's got it.
Okay. Well, shall we adjourn? 4 minutes early for a change, unless someone else, someone else can, Joey, enlighten us.
I don't have any enlightenments.
Oh,
I am doing last week of Peter Rollins's Atheism for Lent that I'll plug, and it's been fun. This week we get Zizek, we got John Caputo, and he even referenced Bataille in his introductory seminar for this week.
Well, I really
Yeah.
liked you tonight. I liked everybody's comments. They were very interesting and really fleshed things out.
well, sadly, just one more chapter and 2 more meetings. So, but then we can do something else, and maybe Ripley will stick with us for the long term. We'll see. Okay, well, good night.
I'll be safe.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye. Bye. Bye.